Then everybody. When I have classes where students are dispersed, I encourage them to come and sit at the center. But I won't do it with you guys. My name is Asher Kaufman, and I'm the director of the Kroc Institute for International Studies. The Kroc Institute is one of the world's leading centers for the study of the causes of violent conflict and strategies for sustainable peace. This panel on the North Korea crisis is part of the institute that's meant to provide on-time analysis, pressing global as well as domestic issues related to challenges, peace, and to offer constructive alternatives to violence, all of its varieties. The panel is co-sponsored by Kroc and the Leo Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, as you can see back. And it's part of our collaborative work that is taking shape now between the different units of the Key School of Global Affairs that has just on its gate formally. To save time for panelists and for your questions and answers, I will present the members of this group together. And we'll start then with George Lopez. The order of my presentation will also inform the order of the presenters. So George Lopez is the Reverend Theodore Hesburgh Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies. Lopez served on the UN Security Council panel of experts for monitoring sanctions on North Korea in 2010 and 2011. And he continues to write and advise on North Korean sanctions and nuclear issues for the UN, the United States, and other bodies, international and American bodies. Mary Ellen O'Connell is and Marion Short Professor of Law and the Research Professor of International Dispute Resolution. She is an expert on international law and the use of force, arms control, and alternative force, such as negotiations. She has published extensively on these issues and is also a frequent commentator, including on matters related to U.S. policies towards North Korea. Jay Lee is a visiting scholar at the Leo Institute and former Deputy Consul General of Korea in Chicago. Michael Dash is a director of the Notre Dame International Security Center. He regularly writes and teaches in the area of national security policy, and this semester he is co-teaching a class titled Science Strategy of Nuclear Weapons with a colleague in this department. Finally, Jim McAdams is Williams Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. He specializes in comparative communism and has just published a book on the history of the Communist Party from the 1840s to 2000. The title of the book is Vanguard of the Revolution, the Global Idea, the Communist Party. And I believe maybe he's the only one, maybe not, among us who also actually visit North Korea. Others? No? So you are the one. There is another person? Okay. Sweet. Cool. So each of the panelists will speak for about 8 minutes, and after the round of presentations, I'll give them one opportunity to comment on each other's reflections, and then we will open the panel for questions from the audience. Thank you all, and I invite Professor Lopez to be first, and can I do it from there? Or
sure. No, this is fine for me.
This is fine for you?
Yeah. It's not an extensive talk. Thank you, Asher, and thank you all for being with us today on this very, very critical situation that's occupied not only attention in the United States, but certainly in East Asia and throughout the globe, particularly as the world heads into the General Assembly of next week, and President Trump's remarks there that many would expect are linked to the sanctions that were passed on Monday evening. This is a very, very critical moment for a definition of U.S. policy and other prospects of the linkage between U.S. policy and UN policy. Let me address 3 or 4 particular themes. One is, as I've been asked to do, is reflect on sanctions. The second is to say something about my understanding of the sanction diplomacy and sanctions dynamic from Obama administration, Trump, without stealing much of Mike's thunder, I hope. Thirdly is to give a kind of critique of that dynamic as it's unfolded over the last 5 or 6 years. And finally, to just quickly give my own projection of where this is going in the future. With regard to economic sanctions, it's difficult to decouple the discussion of sanctions from the long history of this crisis, and time doesn't permit us to go through the various tests of particularly weapon systems, whether it be missiles or bombs, etc. But let us begin with the notion that it's very clear that for every departure from international norms and for North Korea's entry as a attempt to become a viable member of the nuclear globe with testing of missiles and testing of weapons, there's always been a corresponding response of the international community. That international community response took form in particular in 2006 as UN Security Council resolutions began the process of trying to deny resources to North Korea for the production of its program. So the Security Council resolutions of 0607 and the really more stringent ones in 09 that created both the Sanctions Committee and panel of experts were ones that were aimed at denying the resource to North Korea that it might use to enhance its weapon development, nuclear area, and missile technology. In about 2012, sanctions that came in with the first tests by the new regime of Kim Jong-un were designed to move from trade sanctions to financial sanctions. And then they bounced back into 2015 to combine what was left in trade sanctions with targeted financial sanctions and going after what we might call secondary actors in other countries that were seen as enablers and cooperating with the North Korean regime in various forms. So, companies, banks, and the like. The sanction on Monday evening, in a sense, closed finally the chapter on trade sanctions by essentially sanctioning anything else that was to the left with regard to trade. 2015 was the year of going after coal and different iron ores and restricting their sale, and also their exchange in different ways as imports from China. And then Monday night was control of textiles, oil, and the like. The financial dimension is intricate. We can deal with that in different dimensions in the Q&E. What's very, very clear about the financial is what the United States does as an individual state is much stronger against individuals than what the UN Security Council go for. The original draft resolution of Ambassador Haley last week called for direct sanctioning of the North Korean leader, members of his family. The Russians, Chinese, they don't go for that. The Security Council is supposed to give inviolability to particular leaders. Where you go after them, you go after the country. And that dynamic is what we're playing out there. My second dimension concern. In this process of sanction escalation, development, a kind of quid pro quo that with each test then becomes more sanctions, with next advance and test and the defying of the last sanctions becoming increased sanctions. Where does this go? I'll spare you a long history of the condition which typically sanctions for non-proliferation might work, but isolate on 2 facts that we know historically. The first and most important is sanctions work best for nuclear controls if they are always used as a tool in service of a wider set of strategy, which itself is in service to a wider policy. And what I think was the way that was lost somewhere between 2013 and 15 in the Obama administration, and is even not placed at all in Trump administration, is sanctions became the policy instead of a tool of the policy. And therefore, you put so much emphasis on the importance of implementation and are they working and are they strangling the regime? Does it box the regime? Only one choice to give weapons that you forgot the wider policy frame, let's say of security and wider East that this was meant to serve. I can go into more detail on that in the Q&A if you'd like. The Trump administration, on the back of what I would consider the last 2 to 3 years of the Obama administration losing its way on the linkage between sanctions and policy, brought one more mention to this mix, which is a belief that to use the United Nations as a major diplomatic forum, especially one in which the United States would have to make compromises in order to get agreement from other members at the table, was a weak strategy and counterproductive. That the United States, to the extent to which would rely on the Security Council to back up its own strategies or actions, would do so out of a position of strength. That is, using maximum economic means of coercion, sanctions, use them at the UN to create a baseline, which would then allow U.S. Treasury to go deep and rich and broadly, including into now sanctioning entities in China as a way to achieve the objectives, with always underscoring the fact that these might in fact be the beginning of trapdoor to war or the use of military force. So the distinctive imprint of the last 7 months, the Trump administration, reinforced by people who had no affection for the use of sanctions at the start, to be the notion sanctions were an interim strategy of economic coercion, which may or may not work, and under those conditions, we better develop all the military scenarios we can, not because we're going to go bomb right away, but because we're going to continue to scare and lead the regime in a box in which feel they have no choice but to agree with our intended outcome, which is their denuclearization. The dilemma with strategy is the history of denuclearization and everything from Ukraine waking up one morning with the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the third largest nuclear power in the world, to Iran, to South Africa, is that you only denuclearize a state through sanctions if you also have had deep and rich diplomatic engagement, which is highlighted often by a display of where the incentives for giving up weapon systems might be. The incentives, obviously, in the new security system that awaits country, and entering the diplomatic community, economic community in full as the sanctions come on in exchange for control your weapon systems or giving them up in tow, and also the incentives that exist for new elements of economic growth with security, some of which might be based in good old-fashioned deterrence, but others that are based in full integration of your economy into the wider region. We marched to this and gave a structure to it with the Iran agreement and got the security dynamic part, also have not been able and unwilling to deliver the incentives that were expected on the Iran side. So where does all this lead us in conclusion? What would be my speculation? I think because of the quid pro quo tit for tat that we've seen under the Kim Jong-un regime, you're likely to see a response to the sort of sanctions, which will look possibly, I'm not certain, in military form, another test, maybe the ICBM test that everybody was waiting for on the great holiday last Saturday, didn't happen. What you're going to see is a tremendous forum of bombast threat, attempt to drive a greater edge between Japan and South Korea, and an attempt to intimidate the United States into backing down some way, some form, because they know that the United States is not going to launch the first attack. I think that's the short-term dynamic. I have my own prescriptions, better way to go, but we can save that for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to make 4 main points, all related to international law. Several have overlaps with George just said. I won't try to build those bridges, and we can talk about it in Q&A. But here's number 1. There is no like scenario in which any state may lawfully use a nuclear weapon. Second principle, the legality of the possession as opposed to use of nuclear weapons is a more complex question, except in the case of North Korea. As George just explained, the United Nations Security Council made it clear in its own resolutions that its possession of nuclear weapons and a nuclear weapons program are unlawful. Third, military force end a weapons program to respond to a potential threat of future military action, to enforce sanctions, all require, in turn, a Security Council authorization. In other words, no state carry out those military actions lawfully without Security Council authorization. Security Council authorization requires an affirmative vote of 10 of the 15 Security Council members with no permanent member veto. Fourth, no weapon mass destruction programs, nuclear, chemical, and biological, has been through the use of military force. However, several have come to an end, are ending currently, or would have ended in the case of North Korea, through a combination of well-enforced sanctions and diplomacy leading to a treaty. Let me just say a little more about to those points. International law generally prohibits, as a matter of the highest law, U.S. codes or peremptory norms, as codified in the United Nations Charter, that no state may use military force, with two narrow exceptions. A state is the victim of an armed attack, a significant armed attack, may respond as necessary and proportional to regain its, or in the interest of self-defense. Other states may join collectively in the exercise of self-defense, but in all cases, only until the Security Council steps in, it may take over, and is really supposed to take over under the terms of the Charter. Situation, the state is responding in self-defense. Article 51 of the UN Charter. International law also restricts the type of weaponry and tactic that may be used, even in a lawful exercise of military force, whether in self-defense or with Security Council authorization. Under these rules, which are often known as international humanitarian law, or the old-fashioned term jus in bello, as opposed to those I just spoke of on resort to the use ad bellum. The jus in bello, though, the law on resort to force, strictly prohibits the use of any weapon that is indiscriminate, causes widespread damage to the environment, or causes unnecessary suffering. So no state has the right to use certain kinds of weapons in armed conflict, and no state has the right to resort to military force to end a weapons of mass destruction program without the qualifications I just mentioned, armed attack or Security Council authorization. There are 5 states in the world that are permitted to have nuclear weapons. At least these are allowed temporarily under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Those happen to be the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. 4 states nonetheless possess nuclear weapons that are not a party to that treaty: India, Israel, North Korea, and Pakistan. Of these, only North Korea is under a UN Security Council mandate to end its program. North Korea has failed to do so and has come under the increasingly tough sanctions that George just described. Every fully sovereign state in the world, a member of the UN, has an obligation to support those UN sanctions. So sanctions through the UN are a very powerful tool and are, in fact, the only way to lawfully, at the point in time, out Security Council authorization to pressure on North Korea. But as I hope we'll be able to discuss more with George during the Q&A, as we've just seen a confidential UN report that was leaked and reported on in foreign policy, sanctions on North Korea have not been well enforced. But as George also said, even if they had been, sanctions alone do not result in successful termination of WMD programs and will not end North Korea's program. However, a skillful set of sanctions together with diplomacy that has an actual strategy with an end goal, as George said, have been successful in the case of Iraq, Libya, Brazil, South Africa, Ukraine. They all gave up WMD programs through diplomacy paired with a smart sanctions program. Iran is currently in compliance with its obligations that resulted from a similar set of sanctions plus diplomacy. We're all eyes are on the Trump administration today to continue the certification in which experts say Iran is in compliance with its obligations today under that agreement. It will be, I think, momentous and potentially seriously counterproductive to the current situation with Korea if the U.S. does not meet its obligations in good faith to certify Iran's compliance. That will show that the United States is not a reliable part in negotiations and will make any future deal that involves the U.S. with North Korea and ending its program virtually impossible. We had a similar scenario with North Korea. We have very little reason to trust the United States because we had quite a similar agreement with North Korea as we have now with Iran, reached in 1994 during the Clinton administration. But, and you will not hear this from Clinton administration people, put out a factual story that today we might call a set of alternative facts. That they did not fail as North Korea's failure to meet the terms of an agreement that would get fuel resources to North Korea in exchange for North Korea ending its nuclear program. And those fuel resources were of two kinds. There was going to be a long-term light water reactor, set of light water reactors built. And in the meantime, while those were being built, heavy fuel oil was going to be delivered. The President, Clinton, and the Congress got into a dispute, the Republican Congress. Congress wouldn't pay for the light water reactors. The fuel was inevitably delayed. Finally, the agreement came to an end. North Korea, lawfully under its agreement, returned to building its nuclear weapons program. Hindsight is wonderful, but really, could the United States, if we think about what the small investment for those light reactors would have been in 1994 to prevent the scenario we're looking at today, is quite confounding. Let me just say briefly in conclusion, there's a historian who's written about this 1994 agreement, and she concludes that today North Korea remains desperate for fuel. Its regime still exhibits a paranoid, self-serving obsession with security. Its past actions, however, strongly suggest that the nuclear program is a bargaining chip Pyongyang is prepared to give up under the right circumstances. The benefits of a new, more robust peace agreement are obvious: an end to the threat of nuclear war in East Asia, and a boost to the global nuclear proliferation regime. The story of the 1994 framework proves this is far from impossible, but it also proves that it will demand both careful, determined diplomacy and a commitment to honoring promises made. And she says, her final sentence, sadly, the Trump administration so far is capable of neither. So my own conclusion is to say that it behooves the United States to try to reverse the situation of non-trust by strictly complying with its obligations of international law, sending a new message that it is a law-compliant country that other countries can trust in their treaty relations. That's the only way forward, and we're going to have to bring in other more trustworthy partners on this to be our guarantor that we will conduct ourselves as we promised to do. That's the only way forward and to then shift our focus and our resource commitment away from the constant drumbeat and development of a military strategy to a much more effective enforcement the sanctions regime that are in place. So once again, that's the only way that I see forward at any price that I think any of us should be willing to pay. Sanctions, smart sanctions, and with a diplomacy strategy that relies on international law, doesn't undermine it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josh, for inviting me, and I'm honored to speak today. Before I start, I would like to announce that diplomat, I'm a government official, but today I'm in the capacity of a Korean citizen, and therefore my comment today does not necessarily reflect or represent the view or the current position of Korean government. I'm supposed to say the Korea's perspective towards the North Korean nuclear crisis, but before I would like to just give you a picture of the current crisis, which started in 1993, and as Marianne said, had the U.S. and North Korea reached an agreement to freeze their nuclear development program in 1994 in a so-called a framework in exchange for 2 light water reactors and the oil fuel supply. And the agreement lapsed in 2002 with the revelation that North Korea secretly tried to develop their nuclear materials by using the enriched uranium programs imported by Pakistan. And so the second nuclear crisis started in 2002 with North Korea declared withdrawal from the non-proliferation treaties. And the sixth part started in 2003 and continued until 2008. And after that, no talks or diplomacy, serious talks or diplomacy have been going on with further developed North Korean nuclear programs and missile programs. During the time, North Korea did 6 nuclear tests starting in 2006. And then only last year, the Kim Jong regime tested more than 20 times of their missiles, and they very recently succeeded in testing the 2 intercontinental missiles that can reach the main United States. I believe that those are the things that highlight the seriousness of this crisis. And turning back to my task today about the South Korea perspective, I can just say with just one keyword, which is the 4-letter word, fear. I could say with more appropriate, like concern or seriousness or sobering, but intentionally chose the fear that because I think that what is probably very provocative towards the occasion of North Korea. And I think this word fear alters with fire and fury. So I thought that this is a nice word to use. So yeah, today I will try to answer the question. Our South Koreans are fearing the current situation. And I believe the answer is both and no. And let's start with the no. First, when there was a occasion by North Korea, the missile test or the recent nuclear test, the very typical picture in major newspaper in the United States, like New York Times and Washington Post, are showing the picture of South Korea with the broadcasting on their world's best TVs, breaking news of North Korea's occasion of missile test attempts or nuclear attempts, with civilians seemingly indifferent or absent-minded passing by those monitors, showing that South Korea is keeping welcome against those provocations, while Japan and United States are very, very worried about the situations. And why? Why Koreans are so calm and indifferent to those threats. The Korean threats when South Korea can be the real the first imminent threat to provocations. I believe that the first reason is that we get accustomed to those threats from the time of the armistice at the end of the Korean War. Technically, Korean War has not. We just on the situation of armistice, and we have been under constant and daily permanent situation from North Korea. And sadly, we have got accustomed to those threats, and that is why we are rather calm against threats. And this is also the tragedy, but I suspect that most Koreans think that in a very plated situation with very small military compared to even Japan, even to United States, we don't have anywhere to go should anything really serious has happened in Korea. And with our study fact, I believe we have the capability to see the real signs of their operations. Should the United States decide to move all US citizens out of the Korean Peninsula, or should North Korea decide to mobilize their troops closer to DMZ? Those are the things of action can be the real signs that we should be panicking about. But at the stage, we still just worse. Even those attempts of the test of the weapons of mass destruction are not give the enough threats to make us panic at this current stage. And second thing, the reason we are not so panic about those threats or provocations, I believe that what I call the Aesop fables, a boy who cried wolf situations. North Korea has been bluffing their threats very constantly. Even today, they just protested on the adoption of the new Security Council sanction that they are going to sink 4 islands of Japan, and they're going to reduce the United States into ashes and darkness. Those are their bluffing way of threatening the situation. So, having been faced with those, faced with those first blood, so we are more like the people or the neighbors, the situation of the boy who are crying, of not believing that they are not going to be the real situations. And the case of the boy crying wolf not only from the North Korea, but from the sometimes the ruling classes or even governments or the conservative media of South Korea. During the time of the military rules, military rules, Korean government makes use of the situation of Korean threat in their own benefits, and that affects adversely to instigate South Korea. And thirdly, I believe that we just sense supernaturally that they are not going to attack us. I don't know why, but I think that we have some kind of sense of growth after more than 1,000 years living together as one country. That the divided situation is not anomaly, and we don't feel that they are going to attack us with their nuclear weapons. Having said that, the reason why we are not so concerned about the situation, then we are concerned. We are concerned that the possible preemptive or preventive attack or the military actions issued by United States at the current stage. Yeah, I wrote down something here. Yes. The recent comment by the decision maker of the United States saying that they can meet fire and fury with equipment and loaded. Those are the things that Koreans should be very concerned, and we are very concerned. And worse, I would like to quote Senator mentioned that if there is going to be a war to stop Kim, will be over there. If South die, they're going to die over there, not here. Those are the words, and then may bring about the fear and concern of South Koreans. And that is why South Korean president stated flatly and rather bluntly that there are not going to be war in Korean Peninsula without consent of South Koreans. And secondly, and this is the issue of the so-called decoupling. South Korea is the closest ally, one of the closest allies of the United States, and a very serious question that many South Korean news media are raising at the current stage is that would the United States be willing to sacrifice Los Angeles, San Francisco, or even Chicago to defend Seoul? And in that situation of the United States fearing of direct attack from North Korea, South Koreans are fearing that U.S. may not be willing to defend South Korea's security and stability should Korea threaten to attack South Korea. And even in the extreme cases, many South Korean conservative media are saying that the United States might recognize the North Korean nuclear status and eventually sign a peace treaty without resolving the issue of North Korean nuclear weapons and decide to withdraw the U.S. troops out of the Korean Peninsula. Leave South Koreans of 50 million people permanent hostages of North Korea. Let me finish. And those are the fears. And I believe that the way, I just did the way to ease the fears first, maybe the peaceful and diplomatic way of negotiation to the way of the permanent denuclearization. And the secondly, the enhanced containment and deterrence of also is the fear. And maybe third, the way of the missile defense system or the instrument of the thought would ease the tensions and ease the fear of South Koreans. And maybe lastly, this is also the view, but many conservative South Koreans are now claiming that we need to have our own nuclear weapons. And let me just last mention the recent public opinion poll conducted in South Korea that about 60% of South Koreans are in favor of possessing our nuclear weapons. At least the re-instrument of nuclear weapons in the United States back into the South Korea. And now about 5% of South Koreans are against any kind of humanitarian aid in North Korea on stage, showing that we are getting more concerned about the situation. And I start there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger, for the kind invitation. I'll make very briefly 3 points about the military aspects of the crisis, and I'll summarize them as short-term pessimism, medium-term optimism, and long-term uncertainty. The short-term pessimism, the cat's out of the bag. We're not going to roll back the North Korean nuclear program. Sanctions are not work. In fact, we've seen the international community as united as possibly can be as issues. Nobody that's not committed to trying to isolate the regime in North Korea. Well, not one really important country, and that's the People's Republic of China. But the rest of the world, the other 191 states are as united on this as they can be. But the fact of the matter is as long as the People's Republic of China is ambivalent, how I characterize their view about putting the screws on the North Koreans, there's no way that that windpipe is going to be shut down. Secondly, the United States has no good military options to roll back the residual North Korean nuclear program now. I think even before made significant progress in the weaponization of their nuclear program, pretty good conventional deterrent, which is a function of the geography of the Korean Peninsula. Conventional war without nuclear use would have catastrophic humanitarian effects only on civilians in Seoul, but also on U.S. military forces. The United States is also engaged in a pretty sustained campaign of what's euphemistically called left-of-launch measures to sabotage the North Korean nuclear program. For a while, that worked, particularly cyber operations. But the North Koreans are resilient and they're smart, and they figured a way around that. Now, preemptive strikes, which obvious this next option, are not really attractive, not so much the reason Mary Ellen laid out, but because for them to work, they have to be much completely effective. We don't have the intelligence on the the extent of the North Korean nuclear program that we would really need. And we certainly don't have intelligence necessary to eliminate conventional threat to Seoul. And all of this, of course, has become more problematic because North Korea has made advances in their nuclear capability. Ballistic missile defense, particularly the theater-based systems, THAAD and Aegis, the standard missile, are not really a panacea. They're not a panacea for a couple of reasons. First of all, ballistic missile defense has proven to be not foolproof in recent years. Even the continental United States-based ballistic missile system that we have deployed, which should be ideal for dealing with a very thin nuclear threat for North Korea, isn't ultimately going to be a silver bullet. I'm happy for the United States to deploy THAAD to South Korea to reassure our allies in Seoul. But the truth of the matter is that THAAD is also, and the Aegis system, are somewhat problematic in terms of relationship with the People's Republic of China. These systems have put the Chinese systems under some risk. So there's no real way to roll back the clock, which I think is too bad. In an ideal world, I'd like to see a nuclear North Korea. But over the medium term, non-nuclear, what did I say? Freudian slip. So nuclear, I want to see a different talk. The medium term optimistic. And I'm optimistic because I think deterrence in North Korea will. Kim Jong-un is rational. Not a nice guy, but he's rational in the same way that Al Capone was rational. He wanted to maintain his perfect grip on power. And given that, the North Korean nuclear program, on the one hand, is a bolster to his power. He's not going to get Saddam or Muammar, meaning overthrown from without. But if that deterrence works against us, a very small nuclear program with a dubious intercontinental capability, we all have to recognize that our nuclear deterrent, which is about 70 times as large, based on a series of delivery platforms that are highly reliable, are also likely to have a very robust deterrent capability in terms of dealing with him. So the bottom line is, I think we can live with a nuclear North Korea. Now, my long-term uncertainty involves two things. I'm confident that the Kim regime will eventually end up in the dustbin. And anytime you have a state fall apart, particularly a nuclear armed state, it's worrisome. On the other hand, we've had plenty of, or not plenty, but at least one nuclear armed state fall apart, and one almost fall apart, the People's Republic of China during the Cultural Revolution. And so I actually think that the nuclear civil war is not as big a problem as we make it to be. The big thing I worry about down the road is when the inevitable happens, how are we going to manage the situation with the People's Republic of China? And a collapse in the North will tempt the United States and the South, the Republic of Korea, to try to move into the back. The United States to secure the nuclear capabilities of the North, and the Republic of Korea to reunify the country. And that's understandable, but we need to understand that the Chinese would see this from a very different perspective. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is for Chinese a worthless regime, except for two things. One, as a buffer between itself and the United States and its allies. And two, the Chinese Communist Party has this weird dysfunctional marriage with the North Korean regime. That they hate them, but on the other hand, they're sort of joined at the hip because the Chinese Communist Party is complicit in the maintenance of the Korean regime throughout its history. And there's a joke, not really a joke, but it's ironic to think about it. If the collapse of the North would suck South Korea in, unify the country, and the United States to get the nuclear weapons, the Chinese would intervene militarily to seize the archives, to hide their complicity in maintaining the North Korean regime. So the big challenge, seems to me, is for the United States to strike a grand bargain of the future of Korea. And maybe this is something that the author of the art deal now in the White House might actually go for. The deal should be that when the North region goes, that unification of the Korean Peninsula should take place without nuclear weapons and without presence of U.S. troops north of the DMZ. This is could be a moment in history, like President George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev had during the reunification of Germany. Now, the problem is not so much the United States, it's actually the PRC, which has resisted having this sort of discussion because they're in denial that North Korea is eventually going to fall. But denial is a river in Egypt. It's not a strategy. And it's something that the United States should continue to engage Beijing because this is the real problem, in my humble opinion.
So I'm going to say a little bit about this strange thing in North Korea, because it is a really tricky country. It's a very tricky interlocutor for a number of reasons. One thing I learned from being in Eastern Europe in 1989 is that regimes can collapse at any time, or not any time, but they can collapse. You don't expect them. And certainly that's what happened. Nobody was prepared for it. On the other hand, for the foreseeable future, we're not thinking in terms of regime collapse. We're just not there yet. And for reasons that I want to try to outline. And I want to make two general points and then just give you some examples of why I think they're important. The first general point is that when you go to North Korea, what stands out is the absolute control of the regime, the absolute control, which I'll explain in a minute. The second is, and you can see this as historically in the 20th century in North Korea, in the second half of the 20th century, the regime's militant desire to assert its independence. I mean militant. There's a concept called juche, which means something like self-determination, but this is an aggressive, mean-spirited self-determination, which is designed to strengthen the regime and at the same time play upon national sentiments, nationalistic sentiments that emerged after the Korean War, but that existed before. So why is this the case? The first thing that stands out to me, and this is what I experienced when I went to North Korea, it's undoubtedly what you experienced, is the complete isolation of this country's population. The regime is obsessed with controlling information. When you go into North Korea, well, we can't today, but when you in the good old days, a year ago, they only one thing from you, and that's your cell phone. And they have these little plastic baggies, and they take everybody's cell phones and put them in there, and the problem is resolved: information control. As a result of this, I was able to bring one of my books on the reunification of Germany into North Korea, give it to the library because it hadn't occurred to them. There might be other forms of information, but when you're in your hotel room in Pyongyang or another North Korean city, you have TV, and it has two channels. And if you speak in, it's a person saying the same thing on a very blurry TV screen. And I'm sure it's not worth listening to, but it's about the glory. At that time, it was the glory of Kim Il-sung, the dear son, and then his father, the leader, Kim Jong-il, and his father, the great leader, Kim Il-sung. The radios in the hotel rooms have what some can remember from the distant past, and having dials. They have little buttons. You push the button, it goes to a particular radio station, which I guarantee you is a Korean station. So there's just this sense of total isolation. It was the kind of thing you read about, but then you see it, and you can't make sense of it. Secondly, the sense of discipline in society. The well-off, those in privileged positions in North Korea, all live in the cities, and particularly those young lived in the inner cities. And their entire life were focused around discipline and demonstrating your loyalty to the regime, not just by singing patriotic songs, but engaging in endless marches, vast dancing ceremonies, equal tributes, whatever. Discipline. And that begins at a very early age. It sticks with you forever. So some people might say, well, it's so the key element there is fear, but it's not really fear. It's a kind of a religious socialization, a really quasi-religious socialization that people simply accept because this is the experience that they're having. The third is, and again, it gets back to the way these cities are organized. There is, just like the case in the old communist regimes of East Europe and Russia, they're very strong selfists in the regime. So you have a class of individuals, which is small, who might have access, not to cars, never to cars, but might access maybe to a telephone or a couple extra light bulbs or whatever it is, but are nevertheless privileged and desire to carry. Now, they're not thinking of overthrowing Kim Jong-un anyway, because that's an unable thought. But they're also not going to be inclined to accept any idea that the picture that they have as a result of their isolation is any different than the regime tells them. There is, this was what stood out to me, and I don't mean this in a sociological condemning sense. It's almost a childlike quality, at least to the people that I met, and their really surprising degree of acceptance of their experience. We went to Kim Il-sung's mausoleum and saw thousands and thousands of soldiers and women dressed up in these three different colors of kind of folk dress, and waiting to get in line to see the great lead body. And when we got in the room, as Westerners, we got in quickly. I watched as people trail through to look at this glass case that he lies in, bang their heads off. Now, why is this important? This means, this kind of culture means that your ability to influence is extremely limited, more so than almost any country that I can think of on earth right now. Maybe it's the hardest country to influence. And as Mike Dash suggested, the regime is not simply going to say, oh, well, the basis of these benefits you provided to us or threats you made with up our nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, in fact, precisely because the regime is based upon its ability, and this gets back to True J, to show that it's tough, that it's good as any other, North Korea is as good as any other country in the world, and it will be pushed around. In Myanmar, one tour, you can encourage all of you to take it when the border is lifted again. There's a tour of the Pueblo, which was this ship, that American spy ship that was overtaken by the Korean Navy in 1967. And they worship this thing. Why? Because proof that the West is determined to wage war with the heroic North Korean people. Well, in this context, these people believe that that's going to happen, and anything that is said, such as by this president of ours, is something that reflects the regime's interests. The question is, how can you influence it? One is through China. Mike's already talked about it. There are a couple of problems with that. First, as Mike said, Chinese have very strong vested interests in not allowing the United States to develop a sphere of interest in the Korean Peninsula. Secondly, the Chinese ability to influence this regime is much smaller than I imagine. And this has been true ever since the formation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The Koreans have historically played the Chinese off against the Russians and to get various favors from both of them. As you know, North Korea not only abuts China, but also Russia. And neither of those states have been very successful in influencing North Korea to the extent that it would actually change its policy. It not need to, and its leaders are happy that's the case. Second point, the military. I'm sure that there are many military officers that would like to get rid of Kim Jong-un. It's only natural. But the problem is that Kim Jong-un kills them before they can get to him. Very effective. And there's no, my guess is the spirit of deterrence simply kills people to prevent other people from getting looked at. They might take action against him. One way of thinking about the military is, though, there are all different kinds of military. So we don't know what kind of military regime we would get. Hopefully one that was professional and more predictable. But nevertheless, one that would be very glad to have its nuclear weapons. What's the only remaining option? And this is your comment about South Korean attitudes are very interesting. I think the only remaining option is for the South Korean government to continue pushing for improved relations with North Korea. I see that as absolutely the only avenue, because how else to influence a regime that is enclosed in this atmosphere of isolation and the benefits from cultivating an atmosphere of warmongering and fear.
Thank you very much. I want to give a few minutes panelists if they wish to respond to each other's presentations, and I want to say that unfortunately Agdash has to leave in about 5 minutes, so I apologize.
I thought you were sending me out now.
No. You have 5 minutes. I'm going to actually make sure that you do not before the 20. So if there's something that you want to share now.
I think I'm ready to hear from you.
Okay, go ahead. So, questions? Go ahead, please.
I'm going to take two debates that have happened so far. One about the just the agreed framework point of view, which was the U.S. deliver the energy. The other view was North Korean regime as them. I wonder if anybody can solve that. The other debate I hear is that Mike was said there was this regime, it would be peaceful, it would be a vacuum. But I think Jim was suggesting that it would be peaceful because there's such a you kind of transition without there's two dates I wonder if you wrote.
I think I can resolve the first one, so we can move on to the second one. There was actually no inconsistency with what Jay said and what I said. The U.S. was the first party to, you could think of it as a quasi-2 bilateral agreement, and failed. That actually legally allowed North Korea to start, it withdrew from the NPT. So other than that, it had no legal obligation not to produce a nuclear weapon program because the Security Council sanctions didn't come in until after it had revealed that it was starting to do this program. It doesn't mean that we're disappointed that they went ahead with this, and we don't like it. We refer to them critically for having, because even if a state party to a treaty is the injured party and has the right to be free of the treaty and meet its obligations, you always hope they will. So that's partly why the Clinton administration, and as Jay just said, characterizes the failure in North Korea taking advantage of its legal right to start its program. We wish they hadn't. But that's also, I think, a way of sending somewhat present, this is my alt facts thing, that instead of owning up to the fact that it was our failure and we should have come in as soon as we could with a better offer to make up for our reach so we could get back into a position of us going forward, we just made it worse following North Korea regime, and then we had the sanctions regime, and we are where we are today. So you can say that there's fault on both sides, but I think at this point much more important to focus on the fact we in the United States and others of our bargaining party with the exception, I think South Korea has behaved exemplary. I mean, we're talking about the current crisis, but North Korea has attacked in more minor ways, but including the sinking of a Navy ship with the loss of 40 or more sailors lost. And South Korea has exercised such restraint and continued to pursue better relations. And I think we all are of consensus that South Korea should be taking the lead and the U.S. should be following them. And that our own conduct, the U.S. own conduct, has not been exemplary. But so I think it's just there's not a real conflict in what Jan said about the 94 agreement.
I give Mike the chance to speak because he has two more minutes before him go.
Yeah, just, very quickly. And Jim has the advantage of me of, along with Dennis Rodman, being one of the few Americans who've actually been there, and of having written the book on communism. I recommend his new book to you all. I still think, though, that everything that we know about long-term authoritarian regimes suggests that they can be very brittle, and they look like they're going to together, and from the outside or from the inside, in a staged managed way, they look pretty durable. But I just don't believe that a regime that has to engage in as much systematic violence as it does is all that strong. That you can hold on to power through violence, and Stalin did it for a while, and Mao did it for a while as well too. But eventually, the system cracks, and when it does crack, I think the challenge for us is to figure out how we can avoid something worse coming out of it, and that's why I keep coming back to this grand bargain. So.
Yeah, like I responding to Mike and also Deanne's question. Who's to say what will happen in a year in North Korea, whether it'll crack or not? But the lesson there is that you better have relation, that you better have, certainly American diplomats who can somehow communicate through other diplomats and with the North Koreans. But more importantly, you better have good ties you better have some ties between Seoul and Pyongyang, because that's what's required to negotiate a peaceful collapse if it comes to that. And particularly close ties with intermediate level officials who would be likely to take over. Why is this certain? You can look at the case of the Germans. German education proceeded better than anyone would expect, in large part because there were decades of contacts between the two German governments.
Let me just add one. Yeah, I think that we both right in terms of the collapse of the agreed framework. But the problem is that that is the main reason that at the current stage in the United States, most hawks, not just in the United States, but also in South Korea, that hawkish experts are against any kind of dialogue in North Korea, because they truly believe, from the instances of the 1994, that they're going to change. They don't believe North Korea. I'm not against the dialogue, but still, I think that's the main obstacle is to kickstart any kind of current stage. And the secondly, about the issue, inevitable collapse of North Korea. And there were the arguments of the North Korea's collapse in 1990s after the collapse of the Eastern Blocs as a whole, and immediately after the death of the dear leader Kim Il-sung, the first leader. But they maintain the situation up until now. And we South Koreans also fear the sudden unexpected collapse of North Korea. And that we don't think that will positively affect that our real war of reunification. So at this point stage, we are more into the smooth transition of North Korea in better relationship with South Korea, trying to have a very smooth and natural way into the unification. Is at the core of South Korean government. Go ahead.
May I jump in a couple of points here? One is one of the stunning things to me, Dan, and others of U.S. coverage in the media over the last 2 or 3 months about this question has been the incredible inaccuracies and attention to history, not only about what the agreed framework was about in 94 to 96 and what happened. And I don't mean that there's not sufficient blame cast in the United States by the media. It's not what I mean. But there is virtually no discussion of William Perry's negotiations in 99, despite the collapse of the agreed framework for the development of light water reactors and testing on the nuke side. What Perry and then Madeleine Albright in the final week of November came to was an agreement in principle with the North Korean government about controllable technologies. In particular, the supplying by the United States of interesting gyroscope technology that they could use for flights and other kind of things that would be used for weapons. But the disarray in the United States related to the Bush election made that not come to fruition. 3 points here. The domestic United States argument is very, very important. The agreed framework came to be right before the win of Congress and the Gingrich era. And there were no big fans in that new Republican dynamic of this kind of agreement. And the greatest champ against it in the Senate was John McCain. That stretched out, didn't prohibit the Perry mission, and when Perry was in the fore and thinking that Al Gore was going to win, it looked like we could make that bridge connect. That didn't happen, but there was still an opening of dialogue that Korea was willing to have. What really did in was the pronouncement of North Korea and of the 3 axes of evil in the statement by George Bush in 2002, and that's what led to the final set of agreements nobody knew about it until the later 2000s between the Khan network, Pakistan, development of the new systems by 2003. And so it's very important to see that. Condi Rice in her book says that one of the big mistakes we made that led to later instability is we didn't take advantage of where the situation was between 01 and 02. We didn't have to North Korea. We could, as an axis, could have just stayed with Iran, Iraq. They were trouble enough. And she said if it could undo something that was a decision we gave momentum that created more difficulties for us, it was probably that we could have put North Korea in this box. We could have put North Korea in that box, and we put it in the box with the Iranians and the Iraq.
Does she regret that more than invading Iraq?
It's not about regret. It's about catechization. No, it's very important that the tone in which she says. And I was in a forum once later on where she just talked about it as an incorrect tactical decision.
There was a question. Go ahead. Yes.
I was hoping to know more about how you perceive China and China's role, not in this outward effect, so what is happening in the Middle East right now. In India, China almost China has become big when it comes to but India likes to play the big role. And at least 1 year back, China and Sri Lanka went into huge trade issues. So that whole world of China has become very in the past years.
I don't think any of us are China experts, Mona. So I think that's a bit difficult. I've been watching China's growing interest and take a leadership role in the world. And China has clearly figured out that one of the clear points that you raise if you want to present yourself as a world leader is to invoke international law and compliance with international law. So this is definitely the line that China is seeking. They have gotten into the World Trade Organization, and they've complied with judgments against them. Where they're having a little trouble, this is not it has since for decades now, China has tried to, it hasn't fully aged in that it is sought to not take over the leadership role, so it hasn't had to promote itself, and it's having a little difficulty. For example, it wants control of the South China Sea, and has lost a major arbitration against. So even though, unlike the U.S., China is a party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, didn't want to go along with, but it hasn't outright violated. Instead, it has embraced Philippine leader Duterte and found him an easy person to do business. So it's fascinating China's role now with regard to the North Korea crisis. And compared, once again, the United States, China's looking at the voice of reason. They came up with a much more modified version of the sanctions. They didn't want to go as far as the Trump administration was pushing, because they can use this language of saying, we don't want to hurt everyday North Koreans. They already have terrible lives of suffering already. If we go slower, take a more methodical, and I'm sorry Mike is gone, because China has finally figured out what Professor Desch and I are still working on, understanding the importance of compliance with international law, and seeing that what's the point of trashing a rule against preemptive force, as he seems to do and disagree with me, when number one, as he points out, you can't do it anyway, it does no effect strategic good. But second, it undermines position that you absolutely need if anyone's going to trust you to make an agreement on anything. So I think we see subtly, and some of the more positive steps more recently, Mona, with India. India has understood this forever, since independence, because they got their independence. So they've been real champions. They love saying they're a big democracy and so on. Well, there's always a difference between presenting an image to the world and reality, but it helped to have the image, because people then raise their expectation and demand out the reality. So maybe a question to you: do you think could take a more robust role in the North Korea situation and attempt to bring this message of international law and careful diplomacy and good behavior?
No, I mean, India is trying to bring up a nationalist list. The most recent statement was India should really have a war with China and Pakistan at the same time. So it helps to make China look like the bad guy. And obviously, China itself has to become
look like the good guy. Well.
So let me just tell you about China specifically in North Korea nuclear events. If you look at the very well-written book about the situation in the past to the agreed framework called Disarming Strangers, written by Leon Segal, who used to be the columnist of New York Times, there is a clear articulation about the insistence of U.S. establishment, U.S. government pushing China to resolve the issue, believing that China is the only country at the time to resolve Korean nuclear problem. Now the U.S. is repeating the same tactic again. I don't think China only can resolve these problems. The bigger, larger, wider engagement is more important. If we do decide to take a different way of reaching situations.
There was a question. Go ahead.
I have a question for Professor. As far as the good faith aspect goes, I think we need to what are the benchmarks and how can that be
There's actually an easy way. The U.S. always had and enjoyed wide good faith. This is a post-Cold War phenomenon. We have lost a great deal of good faith because in that exceptional moment when the U.S. didn't think had to contrast its conduct with the Soviet Union's. It seems to take some liberties. I think there are many examples I could draw, starting with the Clinton administration that used military force 5 times unlawfully without ever even trying to find a justification in the UN Charter. Unlike every president before, they might have violated international law. They always presented to the world their commitment to the UN Charter and attempt to find justification. So things seem to have gone off the rails then, and I'm as confused as I think everyone else on the panel in terms of what the Trump administration is trying to project as the image of the United States. What do we stand for? How do you think we should go about our relations with other countries in the world? It's causing a great deal of fear. In addition to Jay's remarks, one of our law students spent the summer in South Korea, and she said, very, very similar to what we heard, there hasn't been concern in South Korea. People have thought that these are our brothers. They do awful things, but they're not suicidal and they're not genocidal. And that calm has been seriously disrupted by President Trump. So what good is that doing to send that kind of fear to our close ally, who we absolutely need, as you heard? But we could get back pretty quickly. One thing I think we know about President Trump is he likes to confuse people. So I think that the keeps him off guard, and he thinks he has bargaining advantage by taking his bargaining partner off balance. But he could surprise us all right now by announcing his love of international law, his deep and abiding commitment to the UN as the biggest organization in the world, and that and I don't know, it could have repercussions. On the problem would be of course that how would think in the next tweet he would change all of that, but it's been 25 years since the U.S. tried to take positions clearly in leadership in international law. And we were leaders after the Second World War. The UN Charter is our design, the organizations are designed. We've brought more cases to the International Court of Justice than any other country. And that all changed dramatically in 1989.
There are a couple of questions there. I suggest take them together so that you want to start?
I agree with the history really matters. Like reading the understanding of stuff I argue as well. Like North Korea is provoking at this time because it's US policy has to be very uncertain and well. So given that context, do you agree with what I said that it's provoking because it's fearful of how US might treat North Korea, and also yes, there is North Korea wanting to US, but then does this policy very part of James has said that North Korea should step up and promote reconciliation of countries. What do we expect North Korea to do? Like as Michael has said that should accept this fact that North Korea has become user state. What do you expect in 2021? Because it seems that we have been moving forward.
Take another question. You had, I believe, didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a two-part question. First, when you're looking at North Korea for anyone on the panel, what situation of nuclear fusion are they looking at as an analogy? So they're looking at Gaddafi in Libya, for example, which didn't turn out too well for him. They look at Iraq, which you mentioned, which didn't turn out, and much of that is right and wrong. Right? It seems to be that we sort of bellwether to this. And the second question I had was to use sort of context here. What's part of that? Like what we're getting their lack of nuclear weapons. What do they want?
Okay, let me just answer the second question. So in March or April, there was a secret dialogue in Sweden inviting several relevant countries from North Korea, South Korea, and the US, and several other countries. It's so-called 1.15 process, meaning that people from civilian title but closely relate to the government sectors, and deputy representatives from North Korea are all from the government. And during the private conversations, they clearly mentioned to South Korean counterpart that the reason they want to keep North Korea is the examples, the Gaddafi's and also Iraq, the Saddam Hussein. That immediately after they give up their weapons, they will collapse. That's their true belief. And secondly, in return for their eventual giving of North Korean nuclear weapons, they made it also clear through the various media, and always they argue, unless the United States change its hostile policy against North Korea, they will never ever give up their nuclear weapons. So the only way that we can just persuade North Korea to give up nuclear weapons is for the United States to give up hostile policy. What is the hostile policy of the United States against North Korea? We should know. We should what they really want to ask. We just now suspect what they are going to ask, like the peace or the confidence building measures. We have to sit there to really see what is possible and what would be their fear types.
It's an interesting question about who they're trying to emulate. I think the best reference point might Mao Zedong, because behaving a lot in terms of what they say. Kim Jong-un as to Mao Zedong in the 1950s. Korea, the Korean North Korean regime is based upon guerrilla movements in China and elsewhere, so that they've maintained this mentality of struggle and confrontation. The one new factor is that Kim Jong-un not his father, and he's definitely not his grandfather. And he has very little legitimacy. And that's what makes it very, very, very difficult to now know how to deal with him. And I'm not sure that he has a concrete objective in terms of, you give us this and we'll do that. He's rational, but primary objective seems to be keeping himself at the top of the regime, keeping the regime in power. And therefore, I can't imagine a circumstance in which he or his allies would give up nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are the reasons that we're talking about them right now.
That was so interesting. I just want to add a little bit back to Mike's point of grand bargain. Is that, I mean, I think short term, you're absolutely right. And we've already discussed in our international class, we think this is all about Kim Jong-un staying in power, because what are his options? You know, he leaves and somebody has him assassinated. They had his uncle assassinated, his brother. So he's a little bit in the Assad situation, where he doesn't have any option except to do what he's been doing if really he cares about himself over anything else and living a certain lifestyle. So it's this terrible problem of corruption. But maybe there's a way to respond to that, at least in the long term. The way Mike in the end did say that there's no option, a non-nuclear, because he laid out a pretty unattractive scenario that will take a long time and really careful diplomacy, weighing what states and finding a way to build trust, gain confidence, and faith to create grand bargain that he talked about. But given that there are no alternatives that are good, that seems a very hopeful, worthwhile place to go. And I think we can start. I should have added to Mr. McKenzie's question. We can start at ensuring, and this is actually something all of us can do, that the United States certifies Iran's compliance. That would be a really good, tangible first step of our good faith and commitment to our own agreements that we are a reliable partner ourselves.
I'm going to say a couple of things that are partly in response, but also give way to why we need another panel 2 weeks from now or something. The first is in response to not only what motivates, but also that dynamic of what gives us the idea that they'd be deeply committed to this and would, et cetera, is the new young leader came to the fore with two objectives. One, a kind of shogun philosophy, and that is we will have superiority in the peninsula, and secondly, we'll have incredible economic development. Some believe, I think wrongly, that he will ultimately trade in the incentive-based model some of the nuclear capabilities for incentives from the West, with therefore delivering on the development angle. I believe that absolutely is not the case, despite what I said before. And that's because, in addition to be different from his grandfather, one of the key differences in this regime is it's a kleptocracy. And by being a criminal regime, the military people there are not tied to him on the basis of ideological loyalty, as happened with his father, especially his grandfather. They're part of a patronage and corrupt system that derives incredible benefits. That's why when the Security Council went after financial dynamics and began to bankrupt the regime from 2012 on, the sanctions really could bite. And why came more hostile to them? Because you're in fact taking money out of his pocket. Economic development sponsored by the West demands a fundamentally freer and non-corrupt system. Therefore, he's not going to go for that. The dilemma I have, my late night 3 a.m. fear about why the Trump people have no problem decertifying nuclear agreement is because they don't have in mind a 6-party talk framework that's going to lead to whatever happens with North Korea. So they're not about a demonstration effect. They're not looking towards 2.5 years of negotiations we had with the Iranians. They are thinking this is a solution that will have with old style power politics. And keep saying to the Chinese, buck up, buckaroo, do your part. If you don't do your, we'll do our part. I'm not sure they know what that game is. Okay, but this is the style that they very much are committed to and work. And with all due respect to people whose career is in the military, many of whom I dealt with when I was a USIP that I deeply respect, you have the wrong 3 people very close to the president who have been North Korea haters for all of their military careers. The Secretary of Defense, Kelly, and McMaster. And they're the same way with regard to Iran. And that's a bad dynamic. Why Tillerson has disappeared in the last 2.5 weeks, we have no statement from him after the United States accomplishment at the Security Council. The State Department in Review Journal this week has 7 feature stories, all of which are about cultural affairs. It has no statement of policy with regard to East Asia. My last comment, excuse me for going on a long time.
No,
our colleagues,
there. You have to tell us
our colleagues,
they're willing to go to war. Those 3.
All options are on the table, Mary Ellen. That's the policy. All options are on the table. Now, Jim Lee have really sketched excellently the relationships one to the other of some of the states. What the United States could best do tomorrow is to call a summit meeting of its presumed allies in the region, Russia, China, Korea, and Japan, to get on the same page so that we can present a security framework to the North that may meet some of their security needs. If you're a modern peace researcher, this is a classic example of how a gridism works. Graduated reciprocal induction of tension reduction. Okay, there's a way in which you do this that we use India, Pakistan in the 70s, that have been used with the United States and over time. This fits a grit model perfectly. Slow, sure concession on each side to build trust without threatening deep security interests, built on the notion that no side engage in a first strike. This is a classic model. We don't have a Washington establishment that either knows or understands that, and certainly one that thinks to embrace that is a sign of weakness. Excuse my pessimism.
I was hoping to end on some optimistic notes, but I think we're not going to go there. I mean, I'm Israeli and I come from a different part of the world and different context that, although I know very, very well, sometimes hand spins from its complexities, but we have been present here with the different concepts of complexities, and I'm not sure what's maybe the magnitude of the North Korean crisis far more threatening than at least conflict that I'm more familiar. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank you who came here for this very insightful panel. Thank you very much.